For example, you mentioned no appearances in Mark 16. I think it's implied that there were appearances. It says, so the angel says to them, verse 6, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And so a lot of skeptics get hung up on this verse. It says they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment to see them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
Right, but Jonathan, like that's the trouble. I don't know, you're talking about an inference. The text doesn't actually say it, right? And so for someone like myself, it's well, the text doesn't actually say it. Yes, if you bring in what your preconceived idea of the story is, then sure, it doesn't contradict.
Let me just finish and then we can converse it, because I didn't finish responding to the point. It says it said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, what's Mark's normal usage of that expression? So if you go to Mark chapter 1, where Jesus cleanses the leper, for example, he says, what does he say to the leper in verse 44? See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest. So in other words, say nothing to anyone on the way to going to present yourself to the priest. Now, Mark, as we have it, is broken off at Mark 16, verse 8. And we can only really conjecture as to how it ended originally. The most plausible reading, I would argue, of the phrase, said nothing to anyone, is that the woman did not run screaming into Jerusalem and tell all what they'd seen to the first male that they met. Rather, they ran straight to the disciples without telling anyone else. In fact, if you look at Mark's usage elsewhere, Mark 5:37, for example, Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John. Mark 9, verse 8, suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but Jesus only. Mark 10, verse 18, Jesus said to him, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. So I think it's quite plausible to understand it in that way.
Sure. The trouble for me is that I don't think that Mark is an eyewitness report of any kind, and that, that we're talking about something that was written 40 years after the events, and that it is basically a writing down of 40 years of growing legend.
So I would dispute your claim, first of all, that it was written 40 years after the event. I would date Mark much earlier, but be that as it may.
Okay, let's call it 30 or 20.
Okay,
call it.
It's immaterial to this subject. I don't think it matters terribly much. I don't think the evidence for any conclusion is conclusive. But that what you say that Mark is, you don't believe Mark's an eyewitness account, sure, but that's immaterial to the alleged point, because the point that was being made was that Mark has no resurrection appearances. And I said that based on the way that Mark usually uses that expression, and also the implication in Mark 16 that there were, because the angels tell the woman to go and tell the disciples that Jesus will be meeting with them, that suggests that there were in fact resurrection appearances, even though the ending of Mark has been broken off and we have to conjecture with
But
that.
I think what we can fairly say though, is that even if we grant that, so that you can read the text very carefully and with all the context, and then infer that there were appearances in it, that they are of lesser quality than the appearances in the later books, that there is a progression of that these are inferred appearances in Mark. And by the time you get to the apocryphal gospels, we're having these massive things. And I just,
there's an inconsistency though, because first you've conceded that 1 Corinthians 15 is an earlier source, and 1 Corinthians 15 has an appearance to 500. So,
but this is why I was trying to ask earlier. You're granting that people believed this. Like a creed to me isn't a source. A creed is telling me what people at that time believed. Like Paul didn't make up the creed.
Max, you want to jump in there? Did you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like it would be helpful if we almost kind of agreed on, or managed to get clear on what it is that we agree on. So, I mean, I assume we take it for granted Jesus was crucified. I also get the impression from you two that the burial and empty tomb are very much not things that you two grant. So it could make sense for us to discuss that. And the thing I'm not quite clear on at the present point is to what degree the both of you think that the disciples sincerely thought, whether they were right or wrong, and obviously you think they were wrong, but that they sincerely thought that they saw Jesus alive again, which is obviously, that's the thing that is, often called a minimal fact, in the sense that even an atheist scholar like Gerd Ludemann will say it's historically certain that Peter and the 12 thought that. So do you guys grant that they thought that Jesus appeared to them?
I'm going to jump in. Sorry, because my view is a little bit unique on this, although I'm finding more and more people are agreeing with me. I accept that Peter and Paul both believed their stories. I don't think we have evidence for any individual other than Peter and Paul who believed their stories. So I accept that those two were relaying something they actually believed.
So what about the 12?
I see no, do we have any records of anyone, any of the 12 saying, my name is Bartholomew, I saw Jesus risen. My name is Matthew, I saw Jesus written. My name is any of them. Like, I don't think the 12 basically disappear from history. And I'm not even sure the names of the various lists of the apostles don't even match, although I know that's harmonized, so I shouldn't bring it up.
So, I mean,
But no, I don't.
okay. So, I mean, I think that you would agree that's a minority position. Like
No, the trouble is people say disciples, people say apostles, but then when I press them on what they mean, they come down to, well, I guess we have evidence for these two, but we like to use this broad name of the 12. We like to use the broad name of the disciples.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's extremely implausible. I mean, and I think mainstream scholars, including atheists and agnostics, generally do think that it wasn't just Peter and Paul. I mean, for one thing, so given the extreme earliness of the 1 Corinthians 15 summary, which I think you both grant, I mean, we could quibble about exactly how early, but pretty early. The 12 were a group who existed. I think that much should be uncontroversial. And so for Paul to be passing on this creed to the Corinthians at a time that they could quite happily go up to Jerusalem and talk to these people, to posit that this claimed appearance of the 12 is just sort of fictional, I think is quite implausible.
Well, that's unfortunately, we're coming down to what's plausible or not. Like we don't have, even in Galatians, he doesn't list that he went to visit all the 12. In Galatians, he visited Cephas, right?
Sure, he visited Cephas, who was the spokesman for the 12.
Right.
Well, I mean, are you saying the 12 didn't exist? I mean,
no, the 12 existed. I think the 12 probably existed, and they scattered to history after the crucifixion, because that's really the reliable sources we have don't give us any hint of any of the other beyond Peter
and James, right? James.
Well, James, the brother, or James?
James, the brother of Jesus. I mean, he's
but he wasn't one of the 12, right?
Well, but he was a witness to the resurrection. So I don't see what relevance it has to your point.
Well, but was he?
Well, so 1 Corinthians 15 specifically mentions that Jesus.
I understand 1 Corinthians, but then I would grab the 500 as well, and I don't.
And we know that Paul was personally acquainted with James because he meets with him in Galatians 1.
And do we, in any of those, does James affirm?
In 1 Corinthians 15, that's what Paul represents James's belief as being.
Okay. This is this weird creed that it's like, well, if I met Humpty Dumpty, would I say Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the geese horses and all these men couldn't hobble together again? Or would I relay Humpty Dumpty's story? Galatians, Paul says, and I'm sorry, I'm really monopolizing time and I will be quiet soon. He talks about these men added nothing to my message, which for someone like, you can read it as, oh, we all agreed. But in the very next section, we know they had a very big disagreement. So Paul may well be saying, I didn't listen to anything these guys said. Like, I guess for me, the creed is part of the legend. And it doesn't matter if it happened only 2 years before. I don't think the 500 saw Jesus. I don't think the 12 saw Jesus.
So, I mean, sorry, Paul, did you want to, I didn't want to cut you off.
No. I feel like I've spoken a lot, so I'm going to sit quiet for a minute.
Well, I mean, in terms of the 500, I'll just say something briefly, and then I don't know if Jonathan or Harry want to come in. But in terms of the 500, I mean, Paul is quite explicitly saying some of them are still alive. I mean, so if he thinks that this is totally fictional, then what on earth is going on there? Paul's saying, in that, in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, it says 500 brothers and sisters at once, some of who are still alive, some have died. This is the 50s AD in Corinth, the Corinthians.
Well, some people put that as part of the original creed.
Well, I don't think it really matters actually whether it's Paul's, it's Paul.
Right.
I think we all agree that it's coming from Paul, and Paul knows people in Jerusalem, and he's saying to the Corinthians quite explicitly, you can go and talk to some of these.
Yeah.
people.
How would that work though? Like, I've never been able to figure this out. How would that work? So you don't live anywhere near Jerusalem. There are 500 people in Jerusalem 20 years ago who said they saw a thing.
Well,
go check it out.
Well, Jews went up to Passover to Jerusalem. Male Jews were supposed to try to go up to Jerusalem for Passover if they could.
Yeah, and so you go to Jerusalem and you start asking around which of the 500. Yeah. And we're supposed to suppose also that even if they found someone like that people wouldn't make up. Oh yeah, like for example, the Woodstock concert. There are hundreds of thousands of people who said they were there, even though there's only a few thousand people who were there. As a studied thing. This whole he couldn't, if he said, go check my work, means that the work is fine. That's not the way this stuff happens. The fact that you can say that my work can be checked doesn't mean that the work was checked or could reasonably be checked.
But we also know there was a synagogue in Corinth, and Paul always started off his missionary activity there. I mean, all that's necessary for the point really is that there were some people in the church in Corinth who would have the inclination and capability of going up to Jerusalem. Yeah.
And I just morally say, like, it's human nature that false stories spread, even if there are people around to correct them. That's not an unusual thing.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe we were trying to establish what we agree on, and maybe it's helpful just to come back to that. So, I mean, Paul, you're saying you think only Peter and Paul genuinely thought that Jesus appeared to them.
I feel like all the evidence that I've heard now, and I'd love to learn more, but all the evidence I've seen matches that hypothesis.